This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground of pieces of North America.
It's going down. It's not.
But it's a trash ground.
More and more little pieces of the continental margin are being identified, particularly in southeast Alaska.
Subducted.
Well, it's gone. Down there. But if we could come along there and acoustically run our fingers over it and really determine its actual shape, we would be just vastly ahead.
The Baker slice tectonics. 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 The Baker slice tectonics.
This plate has been basically consumed beneath trenches along the northern rim of the Pacific during, the last 80 million years.
And intuitively you feel that's what plates ought to do. I mean, it kind of makes sense that this is a very little plate. It's not going to move on its own. It's going to be totally controlled by its neighbors.
And there's no really direct information.
And that is on its way northwards. Will presumably arrive in Alaska, I think, in about 30 million years or something like that.
And that happens to be molten rock coming out the volcanoes. And that happens to be molten rock.
Adjacent to North America, sliding him northward into Alaska and building up the southern part of Alaska.
Slices these pieces. They always seem to be strangely looking things. They don't seem to be much longer.
In the mantle of the earth, but it's been contaminated kind of with this sediment.
This sounds funny, but
This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground.
trash ground of pieces of North America.
It may find it very difficult to go down initially, and they may end up with this kind of slicing process that goes on.
And Alaska has been built.
This sounds
Funny,
This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground.
He may be much more prepared to be crumpled or have pieces sliced off it.
It's rock that melted in the mantle of the earth.
and acoustically run our fingers over it and really determine its actual shape.
When you get spring breakup,
Alaska is, this sounds funny, but it's a trash ground of pieces of North America because of the way plates have pushed things around. And Alaska has been built, and some of its mountains have been built because of that, because large pieces of real estate have collided up here. Well, to understand the collision processes and how continents are carved up and slipped around, Alaska is the laboratory. The word Kula, I believe, is an Athabascan Indian word, and it means all gone. And it was named, the Kula plate was named by Tanya Atwater. Tanya had worked out the simple evidence that there was a large lithospheric oceanic plate that was missing up there. The evidence for it is really excellent. And she was the first one to really clearly see this. And said, well, it's gone. And so after this comes the word Kula. This particular plate, however, is one of the driving factors in moving a lot of debris in large terrains. Let's say from at least the Brooks Range out, maybe from the Yukon area out, something like that. This plate has been basically consumed beneath trenches along the northern rim of the Pacific during the last 80 million years.
It's being entirely scraped off. And that's found in a lot of places where you get some of that sediment being scraped off, but then some of it certainly being subducted. And you can follow it by following the reflections as it goes down. Well, that only takes you down like 5-10 kilometers because you can't see it. The penetration depth doesn't go any greater than that. So, you know it made it that far, but the depth we're talking about in the volcanoes is 100 kilometers. And there's no really direct information. You can look for it at the next stage when you recover material, and that happens to be molten rock coming out the volcanoes. I mean, it's not sediment anymore. It's rock that melted in the mantle of the earth, but it's been contaminated kind of with this sediment, and we can recognize it by its distinctive isotopes and trace elements. We have to find out how the crust of the Earth formed, and this is where it's forming right now.
This was reflection imaging on this downgoing plate, this thing that's being subducted beneath the island arc, the very thing that's causing the earthquakes. And we were looking at it with seismic reflection techniques, and then we could map the surface. Now, it's the deformation of the surface which is causing the earthquakes. All right? So my goodness gracious, if we were really onto that thing, we had to wait to map what it really looks like in space rather than listening to it just from earthquakes. Right now, the reason why we know it's there is that there are earthquakes down there, and it signals energy to us. It's sort of like a light going off down there. But if we could come along there and acoustically run our fingers over it and really determine its actual shape, we would be just vastly ahead in understanding the sort of energies that you could radiate from this, how it's being deformed along and parallel to just so much more if we could map it.
When you get spring breakup with ice breaking up on water or on rivers and things like that, you often see two very large plates of ice, and in between them are smaller pieces of ice. And those smaller pieces are just being sort of crushed and rotated between these two larger pieces. And intuitively, you feel that that's what plates ought to do. I mean, it kind of makes sense that this is a very little plate, and it's not going to move on its own. It's going to be totally controlled by its neighbors. And I think that's what we see happening here, that little piece of plate is now broken off. It really is so small that it won't on its own go down and do all the right things and produce all the right results. It's just stuck. It's just stuck. Plate. All it does is just rotate like a little To get a plate to go down for the first time is probably quite difficult. I mean, I think the plate doesn't really want to go down. It's got a lot of oceanic sediments on it and so on and so forth. It doesn't inherently want to go down into the mantle. It may be much more prepared to be crumpled or have pieces sliced off it. Where the subduction is very, very oblique, I have a feeling that it may find it very difficult to go down initially, and you may end up with this kind of slicing process that goes on. The Baker slice tectonics is something which, in a way, I think geology has told us more and more little pieces of the continental margin are being identified, particularly in southeast Alaska. The geologists are finding a little piece here and a little piece there, and they call them terrains. And these terrains are getting about as big as your backyard nowadays. They're getting very, very small. So clearly there must be a mechanism that produces these terrains, that slices these pieces off, and they always seem to be little strange elliptical things, but they always seem to be much longer than they are wide. And it may not be important in every part of the world, but I think in terms of the Cordillera, this part of the world, the geology of southeast Alaska and so on and so forth, it may turn out to be a very important mechanism in understanding where these terrains come from and how they arrive and where they started out and all the rest of it. The other really big terrain that we know about is San Francisco, because the San Andreas Fault runs inland there. So the whole of San Francisco, the shoreline of San Francisco, which is west of the San Andreas Fault, is essentially a terrain, and that is on its way northwards and will presumably arrive in Alaska, I think, in about 30 million years.
This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground of pieces of North America.
It's going down. It's going down.
It's not, but it's a trash ground.
More and more little pieces of the continental margin are being identified, particularly in southeast Alaska.
Alaska is a trash ground.
It's subducted.
Well, it's gone. If we could come along there and acoustically run our fingers over it.
The Baker slice tectonics.
The Baker slice tectonics. 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 Baker slice tectonics.
This plate has been basically consumed.
And intuitively you feel that that's what plates ought to do. I mean, it kind of makes sense that this is a very little plate, and it's not going to move on its own. It's going to be totally controlled by its neighbors.
And there's no really direct information.
We'll presumably arrive in Alaska, I think, in about 30 million years or something like that.
And that happens to be molten rock coming out the volcanoes. And that happens to be molten rock.
And building out the southern part of Alaska.
It slices these pieces off, and they always seem to be little strange elliptical things.
The very thing that's causing the earthquakes.
In the mantle of the Earth, but it's been contaminated.
This sounds funny, but
This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground.
Trash ground of pieces of North America.
It's rock that melted in the mantle of the Earth.
Acoustically run our fingers over it and really determine its actual shape.
When you get spring breakup,
This sounds
funny.
This sounds funny, but it's a trash ground.